So by the time January 6th came around, the Trump team had laid the groundwork for their plan as best they could. They widely spread the lie that there was so much fraud in 7 states their electors should have gone to Trump instead of Biden. They put those lies into documents that were submitted to the courts. They pressured state officials to change their election results to reflect those lies. And when they wouldn't do that, they convened a second set of electors in those states to make sure there would be sufficient confusion on January 6th. They arranged, with the assistance of the official Republican Party, for fake electors to actually meet in 7 states that Biden won, and created fake documents certifying those states for Trump, which they then submitted to the federal government to use on January 6th. They had the stage set for the chaos they needed and wanted on January 6th. Chaos that would give the Eastman plan a real shot. The only problem is that Vice President Pence's lawyer thought the plan was totally illegal.
I am so damn tired of being lied to. I don't think I can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it flies, but I'm not gonna buy it anymore.
Hello, my friend, and thank you for listening to the 266th episode of Congressional Dish. I'm your host, Jennifer Briney. And this episode of Congressional Dish, the first of 2023, is quite possibly the most important episode of Congressional Dish that I have ever produced. And no one is more surprised to hear me say that than me. Because this episode is the summary of the investigation conducted by the unfortunately named January 6th committee during the 117th Congress. And for this episode, I watched all 10 of the January 6th committee hearings because that committee, now that it is the 118th Congress, no longer exists. And I'm so glad that I took the time to do this. Because some of you will remember that when the January 6th committee was formed, I called it totally unnecessary because there had already been at least 11 hearings looking into the January 6th riot and the security failures that allowed the rioters to get into and ransack the Capitol building during the joint session of Congress, which was certifying President Biden's electoral win over former President Trump. I produced an episode about those 11 hearings, episode 236, titled January 6th, the Capitol Riot. Between that episode and the 228th episode, which was about the second impeachment of President Trump, which also focused almost entirely on the riot, I thought I knew pretty much all there was to know. And how wrong I was. Because from watching all of the January 6th committee hearings, I now understand, truly understand, that what happened is so much bigger than the riot that happened on January 6th. The riot is just one piece of the story. And despite it being the most visually dramatic and traumatic for the members of Congress who were in the Capitol that day, the riot is not the most important part of the story. The most important parts of the story happened in November and December 2020 and in the days leading up to January 6th, which is why I find it so unfortunate that the focus, right down to the name of the event, has been on January 6th. Because January 6th was the end of the story, not the whole story. And the American people need to understand the whole story, and I don't think we do. Because this story is a warning about the flaws in our system of government. And this moment is an opportunity to fix them before smarter people who watched and learned from the dopes who orchestrated President Trump's sloppy coup attempt get their chance to succeed where Team Trump failed. This episode is about our system of government and how fragile it might actually be. And this story has a happy ending for now, but we're not prepared for the sequel. Now, before I get into the details of the investigation, I do want to remind you that just like with all Congressional Dish episodes, every hearing that I watched, every document that I mentioned or used for research, every article that I read, everything that was used in the production of this episode is available for you in this episode's show notes. Trust is earned, and chances are you don't know me. And so you don't have to take my word for anything or trust my edits. I give you everything you need to jump down this rabbit hole yourself. The only thing you should know about this episode, though, is that I created a bunch of clip montages, trying to summarize over 23 hours of hearings I'm aiming to do this in under 2 hours. We'll see how close I get. But many of these clips will not have timestamps like they usually do, because I moved the clips around and chopped them up so that I could best tell the story using the testimony given to the committee. However, Here's one of my favorite clip finding tricks. Every one of these hearings is available on C-SPAN. So what you can do is, if you want to hear any of this testimony in context, go to that hearing on C-SPAN, grab a phrase from the clip you're looking for, type that phrase into the transcript search bar, and the results will jump you right to that part of the hearing. But really, I do recommend binge watching these hearings in full. You'll be happy to know that these were not normal hearings. These were productions. These were presentations of information that the committee already had. The members of Congress were reading off of scripts. They were not asking questions in 5-minute increments and giving insufferable off-topic speeches. The question and answer periods went on for as long as they needed to, and there was not a hint of partisanship. I've never seen hearings structured like this before. And unlike most congressional hearings, the January 6th committee hearings were not at all boring. And because I'm cutting out most of the testimony, there is so much more to the story than what I'm going to share with you today. There are fascinating witnesses that I won't even mention. There are possible crimes that I won't even talk about. My goal today is to help you understand the big picture, but the details are fascinating too, and I do think they're worth your time. That said, though, I know that most people don't have 23 spare hours. And so let's get started with the congressional dish summary of the January 6th committee investigation into the coup attempt by former President Trump. And to do that, we have to establish right here, right now, a truth that will remain self-evident: that President Trump was lying and is still lying when he says that there was rampant fraud in the 2020 election and that the election was stolen from him. They were lies because he lost the election and he knew it. And we know this because even before the election, Donald Trump was setting the stage to call foul in case he didn't win. So here's Donald Trump on April 8th, 2020, August 17th, 2020, and September 29th, 2020, during his internationally televised debate against Joe Biden.
You know the things with bundling and all of the things that are happening with votes by mail, where thousands of votes are gathered, and I'm not going to say which party does it, but thousands of votes are gathered and they come in and they're dumped in a location, and then all of a sudden you lose elections that you think you're going to win.
The only way we're going to lose this election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. It's the only way we're going to lose this election.
This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen. Did you see what's going on? Take a look at West Virginia, mailmen selling the ballots. They're being sold. They're being dumped in rivers. This is a horrible thing for our country. This is not going to end well.
And then the election happened and President Trump lost. After he lost, President Trump's lawyers told him that he lost. Here's Matt Morgan, the general counsel of the Trump campaign. And in this clip, he's going to mention Mark Short, who was Vice President Pence's chief of staff, and Greg Jacob, who was Vice President Pence's lawyer.
Generally discussed on that topic was whether the fraud, maladministration, abuse, or irregularities, if aggregated and read most favorably to the campaign, would that be outcome determinative? And I think everyone's assessment in the room, at least amongst the staff, Mark Short, myself, and Greg Jacob, was that it was not sufficient to be outcome determinative.
But President Trump had people telling him that there was fraud and that all of it disadvantaged him. The Trump team, in response, filed 62 lawsuits claiming fraud all over the country, and they lost 61 of those lawsuits. The one lawsuit they won prevented voters in Pennsylvania from getting 3 extra days to fix errors on their mail-in ballots, which had no effect at all on the outcome of the election. The rest of the lawsuits claiming fraud that President Trump lost, well, here's Representative Adam Kinzinger of Illinois.
A federal appeals court in Pennsylvania wrote, quote, "Charges require specific allegations and proof. We have neither here." A federal judge in Wisconsin wrote, quote, "The court has allowed the former president the chance to make his case, and he has lost on the merits." Another judge in Michigan called the claims, quote, "nothing but speculation and conjecture that votes for President Trump were either destroyed, discarded, or switched to votes for Vice President Biden." A federal judge in Michigan sanctioned 9 attorneys, including Sidney Powell, for making frivolous allegations in an election fraud case, describing the case as a historic and profound abuse of the judicial process. Recently, a group of distinguished Republican election lawyers, former judges, and elected officials issued a report confirming the findings of the courts. In their report entitled Lost, Not Stolen, these prominent Republicans analyzed each election challenge and concluded this: Donald Trump and his supporters failed to present evidence of fraud or inaccurate results significant enough to invalidate the results of the 2020 presidential election. On December 11th, Trump's allies lost a lawsuit in the U.S. Supreme Court that he regarded as his last chance at success in the courts.
On top of those lawsuit losses, the Justice Department independently investigated the Trump campaign's election fraud claims, and the highest-ranking officials all personally had conversations with Donald Trump about what they found. Here's Richard Donahue, who was the Associate Deputy Attorney General during the election.
There were isolated instances of fraud. None of them came close to calling into question the outcome of the election in any individual state.
I tried to, again, put this in perspective and to try to put it in very clear terms to the president. And I said something to the effect of, sir, we've done dozens of investigations, hundreds of interviews. The major allegations are not supported by the evidence developed. We've looked in Georgia, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Nevada. We're doing our job. Much of the info you're getting is false.
Here's Jeff Rosen, who was the Deputy Attorney General during the election.
There were instances where the president would say, people are telling me this, or I've heard this, or I saw on television, this impropriety in Atlanta or Pennsylvania or something. And we were in a position to say, our people have already looked at that, and we know that you're getting bad information, that's not correct. It's been demonstrated to be incorrect from our point of view. And been debunked.
And here's Bill Barr, who was the Attorney General during the election.
I had 3 discussions with the president that I can recall. One was on November 23rd, one was on December 1st, and one was on December 14th. And I've been through sort of the give and take of those discussions. And in that context, I made it clear I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit.
And Trump knew. He knew he lost. Here's Alyssa Farah. She's the former White House communications director. And after her, you're going to hear from Cassidy Hutchinson, who was an assistant to Mark Meadows, who was President Trump's chief of staff. And Mark Meadows is the Mark that she refers to in this clip.
I remember maybe a week after the election was called, I popped into the Oval just to give the president the headlines and see how he was doing. And he was looking at the TV and he said, "Can you believe I lost to this effing guy?"
Mark raised it with me on the 18th. And so following that conversation, we're the motorcade ride driving back to the White House. And I had said, does the president really think that he lost? And he said, a lot of times he'll tell me that he lost, but he wants to keep fighting it. And he thinks that there might be enough to overturn the election, but he pretty much has acknowledged that he's lost.
And yet Donald Trump and a group of way too many people in the Republican Party tried to get fellow Republicans to exploit constitutional loopholes in order to keep Donald Trump as president of the United States for another term despite his loss. Now, like I said before, so much of the focus, too much of the focus in my opinion, has been centered on the riot that happened on January 6, 2021. A riot that was shocking to witness on so many levels. You saw it, we all saw it. And you have your own feelings about it. I don't need to dramatize it like the Democrats did during the second impeachment and for hours and hours during the January 6th Commission hearings. And today, I'm not going to focus on the riot because we've already done that in 2 episodes. But I do think that we should acknowledge the basics of the security failures that led to that riot being possible. And I did learn a few things from the January 6th committee about the day of the riot that are worth knowing. So first, to summarize what I discovered from watching 11 hearings about the security failures on January 6th, I can tell you that most of the failures can be blamed on bureaucratic barriers to action, many of them involving the Capitol Police Board, which is the board of 3 people that govern the Capitol Police, which are the police that are in charge of the Capitol building's security, which is a separate police force from the Metropolitan Police who protect the city of Washington, D.C. The Capitol Police Board is made up of the Sergeant-at-Arms of the House, who's basically the head of security in the House of Representatives, the Sergeant-at-Arms of the Senate, and the architect of the Capitol. The command structure put the Capitol Police Board between both of those policing agencies, the Capitol Police and the Metropolitan Police, and action on January 6, 2021. Here's some excerpts from Congressional Dish 236, the episode about the Capitol riots. Here's Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota speaking to Capitol Police Chief Stephen Sund.
I cannot request the National Guard without a declaration of emergency from the Capitol Police Board. It's kind of interesting because it's very similar to the fact, I can't even give my men and women cold water on an excessively hot day without a declaration of emergency. It's just a process that's in place.
Mr. Sund, you stated in your written testimony that you first made a request for the Capitol Police Board to declare an emergency and authorize National Guard support on Monday, January 4th, and that request was not granted.
That is correct, ma'am.
Your testimony makes clear that the current structure of the Capitol Police Board resulted in delays in bringing in assistance from the National Guard. Would you agree with that? That's one of the things we want to look at.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
And so, in the middle of a riot, the chief of the Capitol Police was trying to get a hold of all 3 members of the Capitol Police Board for authorization to call the National Guard, which is ridiculous because 2 of them, the House and Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, were in charge of protecting the House and Senate floors that were being breached and evacuated. They were kind of busy, which is why this type of stuff needs to be done ahead of time. And here's the thing. The Capitol Police Board didn't just delay communications and a working relationship between the Capitol Police and the National Guard. They also played middleman between the National Guard and the Metropolitan Police Department. Here's Robert Conti, who is the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department on January 6th.
MPD is prohibited by federal law from entering the Capitol or its grounds to patrol, make arrests, or serve warrants without the consent or request of the Capitol Police Board.
And so if they can't be reached, well, I guess they can't do anything. Since that recording, the Government Accountability Office has produced a report following up on the reforms that the Capitol Police Board has implemented since the riot and concluded that not too much has changed. The report from February says, quote, while the Capitol Police makes security recommendations, it does not have the authority to implement them. The Capitol Police Board does not have a process for formally considering or making decisions on the recommendations. Without a comprehensive documented process to assess and mitigate risks, there is no assurance that the Capitol Police and the board are not overlooking potential security risks, unquote. And that's concerning because Congress discovered a systemic lack of preparation by the Capitol Police that still, even though I learned about this a year and a half ago, it still boggles my mind. Here's Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon speaking to Stephen Sund, who is the chief of the Capitol Police on January 6th.
Have you ever held a drill to respond to this situation where a crowd pushes past the exterior barricades?
Not this level of situation, no, sir.
There were only 800 people that went into the building. That's not that many. It's insane that they never prepared for the possibility that people could enter the building. We got so lucky on January 6, 2021, that the people who stormed the Capitol didn't fire any weapons because the cops were clearly outnumbered and were easily bypassed without them. Not that weapons weren't there. Again, we got so lucky. Here's Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming in the June 26, January 6th committee hearing.
Of course, the world now knows that the people who attacked the Capitol on January 6th had many different types of weapons. When a president speaks, the Secret Service typically requires those attending to pass through metal detectors, known as magnetometers, or MAGs for short. The Select Committee has learned about reports from outside the magnetometers and has obtained police radio transmissions identifying individuals with firearms, including AR-15s, near the ellipse on the morning of January 6th. Let's listen.
Blue jeans and a blue jean jacket, and underneath the blue jean jacket, the complainants both saw stocked with AR-15. Skinny white males, brown cowboy boots. They had Glock-style pistols in their waistband.
8736 with the message that subject weapon on his right hip.
Motor 1, make sure PPD knows they have an elevated threat in the tree south side of Constitution Avenue. Look for the Don't Tread on Me flag, American flag face mask, cowboy boots, weapon on the right side hip.
I got 3 men walking down the street and Fatigue was carrying AR-15, copy at 14th and Independence.
And President Trump knew that these armed MAGA morons were there. Here's Representative Liz Cheney introducing our next witness at length. You're going to hear from this girl a lot today because she was a key witness. And this intro is going to explain how it's possible that she was privy to the insider information that she shared with the committee.
Today's witness, Ms. Cassidy Hutchinson, is another Republican and another former member of President Trump's White House staff. Certain of us in the House of Representatives recall that Ms. Hutchinson once worked for House Republican Whip Steve Scalise, but she is also a familiar face on Capitol Hill because she held a prominent role in the White House Legislative Affairs Office and later was the principal aide to President Trump's Chief of Staff, Mark Meadows. In her role working for the White House Chief of Staff, Ms. Hutchinson handled a vast number of sensitive issues. She worked in the West Wing, several steps down the hall from the Oval Office. Ms. Hutchinson spoke daily with members of Congress, with high-ranking officials in the administration, with senior White House staff, including Mr. Meadows, with White House counsel, lawyers, and with Mr. Tony Ornato, who served as the White House Deputy Chief of Staff. She also worked on a daily basis with members of the Secret Service who were posted in the White House. In short, Ms. Hutchinson was in a position to know a great deal about the happenings in the Trump White House.
And Cassidy Hutchinson was at the rally on January 6th and with President Trump in the tent outside the stage.
We're going to show now an exchange of texts between you and Deputy Chief of Staff Ornato. And these text messages were exchanged while you were at the ellipse. In one text, you write, "But the crowd looks good from this vantage point as long as we get the shot. He was effing furious." But could you tell us, first of all, who it is in the text who was furious?
The he in that text that I was referring to was the president.
And why was he furious, Ms. Hutchinson?
He was furious because he wanted the arena that we had on the ellipse to be maxed out at capacity for all attendees. The advance team had relayed to him that the mags were free-flowing. Everybody who wanted to come in had already come in, but he still was angry about the extra space and wanted more people to come in.
Crowd size. Trump has had a hang-up about his tiny crowd size since the birth of his administration until its death. But to be fair, on January 6th, it was cold that day. But Trump being Trump, he was pissed that there weren't enough unarmed maggots to fill his outdoor arena. Here's Cassidy Hutchinson.
And that's what Tony had been trying to relay to him that morning. You know, it's not the issues that we encountered on the campaign. We have enough space, or they don't want to come in right now. They have weapons that they don't want confiscated by the Secret Service, and they're fine on the mall. They can see you on the mall, and they want to march straight to the Capitol from the mall. But when we were in the offstage announce tent, I was part of a conversation. I was in the vicinity of a conversation where I overheard the president say something to the effect of, you know, I don't effing care that they have weapons. They're not here to hurt me. Take the effing mags away. Let my people in. They can march to the Capitol from here. Let the people in. Take the effing mags away.
He wanted to remove the metal detectors. That is so reckless. And then Trump directed these people that he knew were armed towards the Capitol during his rally speech. During the rushed impeachment of President Trump a few weeks after the riot, we didn't know what Trump knew and what he didn't. And so it did appear that Trump's speech was, speech and protected by the First Amendment. But since then, according to the January 6th committee's final report, quote, a federal court has already concluded that President Trump's statements during his ellipse speech were, quote, plausibly words of incitement not protected by the First Amendment, unquote. And so Donald Trump might very well be criminally liable for directing the crowd, the armed crowd, to march towards the Capitol on January 6th, a march that was not permitted even though the rally was. And it's very clear that the people who joined that march and then the riot were following Trump's lead. Here's a montage of a bunch of MAGA morons whose names don't matter testifying to the January 6th committee lawyers.
What really made me want to come was the fact that, I had supported Trump all that time. I did believe, that the election was being stolen. And Trump asked us to come.
he personally asked for us to come to D.C. that day. And I thought, for everything he's done for us, if this is the only thing he's going to ask of me, I'll do it.
We're going to walk down to the Capitol.
Did you recall President Trump mentioning going to the Capitol during his speech?
Oh, yeah. So that's one of my disappointments. He said he was going to go with us, that he was going to be there.
I know why I was there, and that's because he called me there, and he laid out what is happening in our government. He laid it out.
But I remember Donald Trump telling people to be there, right? I mean, to support.
So you mentioned that the president asked you. Do you remember a specific message?
Basically, yeah, he asked for us to come to D.C., that big things are going to happen.
What got me interested, he said, I have something very important to say on January 6th or something like that, is what got me interested to be there.
You know, Trump has only asked me for two things. He asked me for my vote, and he asked me to come on January 6th.
And then after these dumbs marched on the Capitol and started to riot, what did Donald Trump do? Well, the testimony from all the witnesses was consistent. Here are January 6th committee lawyers questioning, in this order, Kayleigh McEnany, who is the former White House press secretary, General Keith Kellogg, who is the former national security advisor to Vice President Pence, Molly Michael, who's the former executive assistant to the president, and Pat Cipollone, who is the former White House counsel.
And to your knowledge, was the president in that private dining room the whole time that the attack on the Capitol was going on? Or did he ever go, to, again, only to your knowledge, to the Oval Office, to the White House Situation Room, anywhere else?
So that's my recollection. He was always in the dining room.
Yeah, what did they say, Mr. Meadows or the president, at all, during that brief encounter that you were in the dining room? What do you recall?
I think everybody was watching the TV.
Do you know whether he was watching TV in the dining room when you talked to him on January 6th?
It's my understanding he was watching television.
When you were in the dining room in these discussions, was the violence at the Capitol visible on the screen on the television?
Yes.
So President Trump was watching the riot on TV. But there's one thing the January 6th committee never addressed about what happened with President Trump during the riot, but that I learned in the hearings that I watched from early 2021 about the security failures, something that I think matters and that you should know. Because while it is crystal clear that Trump chose to do nothing to stop the riot, he also did nothing to hold back law enforcement, which on January 6th was a key question of mine. Here's another flashback to episode 236, the Capitol riot episode. So first of all, the National Guard command structure in Washington, D.C. is unique. Here's Robert Conti, the acting chief of police for the Metropolitan Police Department on January 6th.
The President of the United States, not the mayor of the District of Columbia, controls the D.C. National Guard.
Which is why we were wondering if President Trump was using his authority to keep the National Guard away to maybe help his rioters stay inside the Capitol. And Representative Carolyn Maloney of New York was wondering that too. Here she is on May 12th questioning the guy who was our defense secretary on January 6th, Chris Miller.
Mr. Miller, you were the acting secretary of defense on January 6th. Did President Trump, as the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Armed Forces, call you during the January 6th attack to ensure the Capitol was being secured? Mr. Miller.
No, I had all the authority I needed from the president to fulfill my constitutional duties.
The Senate report says that President Trump gave the authority to activate the National Guard on January 3rd. And on January 6th, here's Senator Hank Johnson of Georgia questioning Defense Secretary Miller.
Were you ordered to delay deployment of troops?
110% absolutely not. No, that is not the case.
President Trump was the commander-in-chief, and if he wanted to order the military to assist with his attempt to stay president, if he wanted to go all-in military coup style, he could have. He also could have personally intervened to tell the National Guard not to help, and he didn't do that. And that fact shouldn't be ignored, and yet, for some reason, it was by the January 6th committee. Regardless, President Trump might still be held criminally liable for his actions leading up to the riot because the January 6th committee concluded by sending 4 criminal referrals to the Justice Department basically handing the Justice Department all the evidence the committee collected, all wrapped up with a pretty bow. Here's Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland explaining why the committee sent the referrals to the Justice Department.
The dangerous assault on American constitutional democracy that took place on January 6, 2021, consists of hundreds of individual criminal offenses. Most such crimes are already being prosecuted by the Department of Justice. We proposed to the committee advancing referrals where the gravity of the specific offense, the severity of its actual harm, and the centrality of the offender to the overall design of the unlawful scheme to overthrow the election compel us to speak. Ours is not a system of justice where foot soldiers go to jail and the masterminds and ringleaders get a free pass.
The soldiers who served at Abu Ghraib in Iraq and who went to jail for torturing prisoners while those that ordered them to do it were promoted, they might beg to differ. That might be exactly the kind of system of justice that we have, one where the foot soldiers go to jail and the masterminds live out their days with uninterrupted freedom. And whether or not Donald Trump ends up behind bars will be illustrative of what our system of justice actually is, one way or another. But the Justice Department is investigating Donald Trump and his partners for crimes. Many crimes. And the January 6th committee sent the Justice Department the information they collected about violations of this part of federal law in regards to the riot. Here's Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland.
The fourth and final statute we invoke for referral is Title 18, Section 2383. The statute applies to anyone who incites, assists, or engages in insurrection against the United States of America, and anyone who gives aid or comfort to an insurrection. An insurrection is a rebellion against the authority of the United States.
Out of all of the four charges referred to the Justice Department by the committee, this one will be the hardest to prove. But the other three are the big deals anyway. The other three are the ones that matter the most. The ones related to Donald Trump and his partners' attempts to submit fake documents to the federal government in order to challenge certified election results, to get vote counts changed by Republican officials, to remove officials from power who would not help them, all in an overall coup attempt, a coordinated attempt to keep Donald Trump in the presidency despite his election loss. And so let's start with the fake documents. Here's the charge that the January 6th committee referred to the Justice Department in regards to fake documents. Here's Representative Jamie Raskin of Maryland.
Third, we make a referral based on Title 18, Section 1001, which makes it unlawful to knowingly and willfully make materially false statements to the federal government. The evidence clearly suggests that President Trump conspired with others to submit slates of fake electors to Congress and the National Archives. We believe that this evidence we set forth in our report is more than sufficient for a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump and others in connection with this offense.
Fake electors. Now, I think this plot would be eliciting a lot more outrage from the American people if any of us knew what the hell fake electors means. And so, let me explain. Every 4 years, when we voters cast ballots in a presidential election, we aren't actually voting for president. In reality, we are choosing between slates of electors pledged to one of the candidates. In this case, in 2020, we were voting for slates of electors for either Democratic Party nominee Joe Biden or Republican Party nominee Donald Trump. Now, electors are people. They're human beings. And these electors are chosen by political parties in each state. The rules are different depending on the state, but in general, they tend to be ex-lawmakers, party donors, people that are well connected inside of the party and who party leaders want to honor. For every presidential election, there are 538 electors who cast the actual votes for president and vice president, one for each U.S. senator and U.S. representative, plus 3 for Washington, D.C., which gets 3 electoral votes in the presidential election, even though it has no voting representation in Congress. The group of electors representing the winning candidate's party in each state, they meet a few weeks after the election to sign a certificate declaring the winner of that state. Then those certificates get sent to the federal government. The day those certifications happen is the day that the election is officially over. And in 2020, that day was December 14th. January 6th is just the day that the certifications get reported to Congress. which I don't think should get lost in the shuffle here. The Trump campaign, by focusing their efforts on January 6th, actually picked the wrong day. December 14th would have been a wiser day for a coup attempt. But this is one of the reasons why I feel that this whole debacle is so important. This coup attempt was orchestrated by a band of morons. A smarter group poking at our constitutional loopholes might have been successful. And this is an excellent opportunity to close the loopholes, or even the mirage of loopholes that these dopes exposed. But as for the dopes on the Trump team, the architect of Donald Trump's devious scheme to remain president was a man that will be in every third grade textbook until the end of time as one of America's most notorious villains. His name is John Eastman. John Eastman has always been a politically motivated lawyer. He was at one time the chair of the Federalist Society, a group of proudly partisan conservative and libertarian lawyers. After President Trump lost the election, John Eastman emerged from Chapman University, where he was a law professor, to present President Trump with a plan for remaining president despite his loss, a plan written in shockingly blunt detail in a 2-page memo. And here's the plan, as explained in the Eastman memo. On January 6th, Eastman suggested the Vice President Mike Pence, in his position as the person that reads the certificates created by the electors and sent over from the states, would open the certificates in the joint session of Congress as usual. But 7 states, all states won by Joe Biden, would have 2 certificates each. 1 certificate signed by the real electors, the Biden electors, and 1 certificate signed by fake electors, Republican Party electors that certified that Trump had won their state, even though he didn't. Because of the double certificate situation in those 7 states, Vice President Pence would announce that because of the ongoing disputes in those 7 states, no electors could be deemed validly appointed in those states. That would mean that the total number of electors would be reduced from 538 to 454. The Constitution says that the election would be won by the person who gets, quote, the majority of the electors appointed, unquote. And since the new total is 554, a majority of that would be 228 instead of 270 to win. With those 7 Biden states eliminated, that would have put the score at 232 electors for Trump and 222 for Biden. Vice President Pence would then gavel President Trump in as reelected. The memo then goes on to say that Democrats would then essentially lose their shit. And quoting now from the Eastman memo, quote, Pence says, fine. Pursuant to the 12th Amendment, no candidate has achieved the necessary majority. That sends the matter to the House, where the, quoting from the Constitution, quote, votes shall be taken by states, the representation from each state having 1 vote, unquote. Republicans currently control 26 of the state delegations, the bare majority needed to win that vote. President Trump is reelected there as well, unquote. And that was the plan that the Trump team ran with. And to make this plan work, they needed help from inside Congress. Because in order for the electors from those 7 states to be set aside, there would need to be members of Congress willing to officially challenge the electors from those states. For each state, there would need to be 1 member of the House and 1 member of the Senate. And there were more than enough Republican members of Congress willing to help, and they gathered at the White House on December 21st. Here's Representative Stephanie Murphy from Florida.
According to White House visitor logs obtained by the committee, members of Congress present at the White House on December 21st included Congressman Brian Babin, Andy Biggs, Matt Gaetz, Louis Gohmert, Paul Gosar, Andy Harris, Jody Heiss, Jim Jordan, and Scott Perry. Then Congresswoman-elect Marjorie Taylor Greene was also there. We've asked witnesses what happened during the December 21st meeting, and we've learned that part of the discussion centered on the role of the vice president during the counting of the electoral votes. These members of Congress were discussing what would later be known as the Eastman theory, which was being pushed by attorney John Eastman.
The Eastman plan was a team effort, a team that included President Trump, John Eastman, Trump's lawyer who might be disbarred because of this, Rudy Giuliani. There were people at the Republican National Committee, including the chair of the RNC, current Republican members of Congress, and way too many others. And one of the things they tried to do in service of this plan was to pressure state officials to simply change the vote tallies so that Trump would be the winner. We have Trump himself on tape doing this to Brad Raffensperger. Here's the chairman of January 6th Committee, Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi.
Brad Raffensperger is the 29th Secretary of State of Georgia, serving in this role since 2019. As an elected official and a Republican, Secretary Raffensperger is responsible for supervising elections in Georgia and maintaining the state's public records.
And Brad Raffensperger testified to the January 6th committee on June 21st, 2021.
Secretary Raffensperger, thank you for being here today. You've been a public servant in Georgia since 2015, serving first as a member of the Georgia House of Representatives, and then, since January 2019, as Georgia's Secretary of State. As a self-described conservative Republican, is it fair to say that you wanted President Trump to win the 2020 election?
Yes, it is.
Here's Representative Adam Schiff of California taking over the questioning.
Secretary Raffensperger, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election in Georgia, and by what margin?
President Biden carried the state of Georgia by approximately 12,000 votes.
Now, the reason that Raffensperger was called to the committee to testify is because he received a call from President Trump himself on January 2nd. Here's Representative Adam Schiff of California.
Bear in mind, as we discuss this call today, that by this point in time, early January, the election in Georgia had already been certified. But perhaps more important, the President of the United States had already been told repeatedly by his own top Justice Department officials that the claims he was about to make to you about massive fraud in Georgia were completely false.
And here's the highlights from that call. The call was about an hour long, and you can find the full call and the transcript in this episode's show notes, because the whole thing is bonkers. But here is a summary of it.
If we could just go over some of the numbers, I think it's pretty clear that we won. We won very substantially, Georgia, but we've had hundreds of thousands of ballots that we're able to actually will get you a pretty accurate number. You don't need much of a number, because the number that in theory I lost by the margin would be 11,779. And even if you cut them in half, and cut them in half again, it's more votes than we need.
Well, Mr. President, the challenge that you have is the data you have is wrong.
And you will be at 11,779 within minutes. It's more illegal for you than it is for them, because you know what they did and you're not reporting it. That's a criminal offense. And you can't let that happen. That's a big risk to you and to Ryan, your lawyer. That's a big risk. So look, all I want to do is this. I just want to find 11,780 votes, which is one more than we have, because we won the state, and flipping the state is a great testament to our country, because, So what are we going to do here, folks? I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break.
In addition to that call to the Secretary of State of Georgia, President Trump also called Georgia's Governor Brian Kemp and Georgia's Attorney General Chris Carr, asking them to contest the state's election results. Within days of these calls becoming public knowledge, the district attorney in Fulton County, Georgia, opened a criminal investigation into them as possible solicitations to commit election fraud, which is a felony, along with other misdemeanor criminal charges in the state of Georgia. Donald Trump and his team also tried to pressure officials in Arizona to falsify their election results. Here's Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi speaking to Rusty Bowers of Arizona in the June 21st, 2021 hearing.
Speaker Bowers, thank you for being with us today. You're the Speaker of the Arizona House and a self-described conservative Republican. You campaigned for President Trump and with him during the 2020 election. Is it fair to say that you wanted Donald Trump to win a second term in office? Please.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
And is it your understanding that President Biden was the winner of the popular vote in Arizona in 2020?
Yes, sir.
And here's Representative Adam Schiff of California taking over the questioning of Rusty Bowers.
Before we begin with the questions that I had prepared for you, I wanted to ask you about a statement that former President Trump issued, which I received just prior to the hearing. Former President Trump begins by calling you a rhino, Republican in name only. He then references a conversation in November 2020 in which he claims that you told him that the election was rigged and that he had won Arizona. To quote the former president, during the conversation, he told me the election was rigged and that I won Arizona, unquote. Is that false?
Anywhere, anyone, anytime has said that I said the election was rigged, that would not be true.
And when the former president in his statement today claimed that you told him that he won Arizona, is that also false?
That is also false.
Mr. Bowers, I understand that after the election, you received a phone call from President Trump and Rudy Giuliani in which they discussed the result of the presidential election in Arizona. If you would, tell us about that call.
Mr. Giuliani came on first, and niceties. Then Mr. Trump, President Trump, then President Trump came on.
During that conversation, did you ask Mr. Giuliani for proof of these allegations of fraud that he was making?
On multiple occasions, yes.
And when you asked him for evidence of this fraud, what did he say?
He said that they did have proof, and I asked him, do you have names? For example, we have 200,000 illegal immigrants, some large number, 5,000 or 6,000 dead people, etc. And I said, do you have their names? Yes. Will you give them to me? Yes. The president interrupted and said, give the man what he needs, Rudy. He said, I will. And that happened on at least 2 occasions, that interchange in the conversation.
And did you ever receive from him that evidence either during the call, after the call, or to this day?
Never.
What was the ask during this call?
The ones I remember were first that we would hold, that I would allow an official committee at the Capitol so that they could hear this evidence and that we could take action thereafter. I said, to what end? To what end the hearing? He said, well, we have heard by an official high up in the Republican legislature that there is a legal theory or a legal ability in Arizona that you can remove the electors of President Biden and replace them. And we would like to have the legitimate opportunity through the committee to come to that end and remove that. And I said, that's something that's totally new to me. I've never heard of any such thing. And I would never do anything of such magnitude without deep consultation with qualified attorneys. And I said, I've got some good attorneys, and I'm going to give you their names. But you're asking me to do something against my oath, and I will not break my oath.
Speaker Bowers, did the president call you again in later in December?
He did, sir.
Did you tell the president in that second call that you supported him, that you voted for him, but that you were not going to do anything illegal for him?
I did, sir.
Nevertheless, his lawyer, John Eastman, called you some days later. And what did Dr. Eastman want you to do?
That we would, in fact, take a vote to overthrow, or I shouldn't say overthrow, that we would decertify the electors, and that because we had plenary authority to do so. But I said, what would you have me do? And he said, just do it and let the court sort it out. And I said, you're asking me to do something that's never been done in history, the history of the United States, and I'm going to put my state through that without sufficient proof, and that's going to be good enough with me? That I would put us through that, my state, that I swore to uphold both in Constitution and in law? No, sir.
And the pressure campaign on Rusty Bowers by Team Trump continued right up to January 6th.
Did you also receive a call from U.S. Representative Andy Biggs of Arizona on the morning of January 6th?
I did.
And what did Mr. Biggs ask you to do?
I believe that was the day that the vote was occurring to each state to have certification, or to declare the certification of the electors. And he asked if I would sign on both to a letter that had been sent from my state and or that I would support the decertification of the electors. And I said I would not.
They pressured Georgia officials. They pressured Arizona officials. And they didn't stop there. Here are some highlights of a long montage created by the January 6th committee about President Trump and his lawyers' efforts to pressure other state officials to give Biden's electoral votes to Trump. In the following clip, you're going to hear from Josh Roselman, who is one of the January 6th committee lawyers who is summarizing in this whole montage. Then you'll hear from another January 6th committee lawyer who is speaking to Mike Shirkey, who is the majority leader of the Michigan Senate.
The pressure campaign to get state legislators to go along with the scheme intensified when President Trump invited delegations from Michigan and Pennsylvania to the White House.
Either you or Speaker Chatfield, did you make the point to the president that you were not going to do anything that violated Michigan law?
I believe we did. Whether or not it was those exact words or not, but I think that the words that I would have more likely used is we were going to follow the law.
Nevertheless, the pressure continued. The next day, President Trump tweeted, quote, "Hopefully the courts and or legislatures will have the courage to do what has to be done to maintain the integrity of our elections and the United States of America itself. The world is watching." He posted multiple messages on Facebook listing the contact information for state officials and urging his supporters to contact them to, quote, "demand a vote on decertification." These efforts also involved targeted outreach to state legislators from President Trump's lawyers and from Trump himself.
Hi, Representative. My name is Angela McCallum. I'm calling from Trump campaign headquarters in Washington, D.C. You do have the power to reclaim your authority and send a slate of electors that will support President Trump and Vice President Pence.
Another legislator, Pennsylvania House Speaker Brian Cutler, received daily voicemails from Trump's lawyers in the last week of November. Cutler felt that the outreach was inappropriate and asked his lawyers to tell Rudy Giuliani to stop calling, but Giuliani continued to reach out.
I understand that you don't want to talk to me now. I just want to bring some facts to your attention and talk to you as a fellow Republican.
These ads were another element in the effort. The Trump campaign spent millions of dollars running ads online and on television.
The evidence is overwhelming. Call your governor and legislators. Demand they inspect the machines and hear the evidence.
Despite that public pressure campaign, these Republican officials kept saying no. And so the Trump team moved forward with their fake electors plan without their help. On December 14th, 2020, that was the day that the electors met all over the country to certify the election for President Biden. And the election was certified with no problems in all 50 states. But on the same day, in 7 states that were won by President Biden, illegitimate, fake electors who had been gathered with the assistance of people at the head of the National Republican Party, they met and signed documents certifying a Trump win in those states, even though Trump had lost. The fake documents were signed by well-known Republicans, including lawmakers and party leaders in Georgia, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Nevada, and New Mexico, states accounting for a combined 84 electoral votes. If all were to go according to the Eastman plan, these fake documents would be used by Vice President Pence on January 6th to get those 84 electoral votes tossed in the trash, lowering the totals just enough so that Trump would have beaten Biden by 10. Here are the highlights of the testimony submitted to the January 6th committee about the fake elector part of the plan to keep Trump as president despite his role as the loser.
My name is Casey Lucier. I'm an investigative counsel for the House Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. On November 18th, a lawyer working with the Trump campaign named Kenneth Cheesebro wrote a memo arguing that the Trump campaign should organize its own electors in the swing states that President Trump had lost. The Select Committee received testimony that those close to President Trump began planning to organize fake electors for Trump in states that Biden won in the weeks after the election. At the president's direct request, the RNC assisted the campaign in coordinating this effort.
The next witness who's going to be questioned by the January 6th committee lawyers is Ronna Romney McDaniels. Yes, as in that Romney, she's Mitt Romney's niece. But she's been the National Republican Committee chair since Trump's inauguration weekend. During the 2 months after the election, the Republican Party, under her leadership, helped Trump create the fake documents that were submitted to the National Archives and Congress. Here's her confession.
What did the president say when he called you?
Essentially, he turned the call over to Mr. Eastman, who then proceeded to talk about the importance of the RNC helping the campaign gather these contingent electors in case any of the legal challenges that were ongoing changed the result of any of the states. I think more just helping them reach out and assemble them. But my understanding is the campaign did take the lead, and we just were helping them in that role.
As President Trump and his supporters continued to lose lawsuits, some campaign lawyers became convinced that convening electors in states that Trump lost was no longer appropriate.
The next two speakers are former Trump campaign lawyers Justin Clark and Matt Morgan.
I just remember I either replied or called somebody saying, unless we have litigation pending that's like in these states, like I don't think this is appropriate, or this isn't the right thing to do. I'm out.
At that point, I had Josh Finley email Mr. Chesbrough politely to say, this is your task. You are responsible for the Electoral College issues moving forward. And this was my way of taking that responsibility to zero.
The committee learned the White House counsel's office also felt the plan was potentially illegal.
The following questions are going to be directed at Cassidy Hutchinson.
And so to be clear, did you hear the White House counsel's office say that this plan to have alternate electors meet and cast votes for Donald Trump in states that he had lost was not legally sound?
Yes, sir. The Select Committee interviewed several of the individual fake electors, as well as Trump campaign staff who helped organize the effort.
This is Robert Sinners, who worked for Donald Trump's 2020 campaign.
We were just, kind of useful idiots or rubes at that point. A strong part of me really feels that it's just kind of as the road continued and as that was failure, that got formulated as what do we have on the table? Let's just do it.
And now, after what we've told you today about the Select Committee's investigation about the conclusion of the professional lawyers on the campaign staff, Justin Clark, Matt Morgan, and Josh Finley, about their unwillingness to participate in the convening of these electors, how does that contribute to your understanding of these issues?
I'm angry. Because I think in a sense, no one really cared if people were potentially putting themselves in jeopardy.
Would you have not wanted to participate in this any further as well?
I absolutely would not have. Had I known that the three main lawyers for the campaign that I've spoken to in the past and were leading up were not on board. Yeah.
This is Andrew Hitt, who's the former chair of the Republican Party in Wisconsin and one of the people who signed the fake documents.
I was told that these would only count if a court ruled in our favor. So that would have been using our electors. It would have been using our electors in ways that we weren't told about, and we wouldn't have supported.
Documents obtained by the Select Committee indicate that instructions were given to the electors in several states that they needed to cast their ballots in complete secrecy. Because this scheme involved fake electors, those participating in certain states had no way to comply with state election laws, like where the electors were supposed to meet. One group of fake electors even considered hiding overnight to ensure that they could access the state capitol, as required in Michigan.
Here are the January 6th committee lawyers questioning Laura Cox, the former chair of the Michigan Republican Party, who did not participate in the fake elector plan.
Did Mr. Norton say who he was working with at all on this effort to have electors meet?
He said he was working with the president's campaign. He told me that the Michigan Republican electors were planning to meet in the Capitol and hide overnight so that they could fulfill the role of casting their vote in per law in the Michigan chambers. And I told him in no uncertain terms that that was insane and inappropriate.
In one state, the fake electors even asked for a promise that the campaign would pay their legal fees if they got sued or charged with a crime. Ultimately, fake electors did meet on December 14th, 2020 in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, New Mexico, Nevada, and Wisconsin. At the request of the Trump campaign, the electors from these battleground states signed documents falsely asserting that they were the, quote, duly elected electors from their state, and submitted them to the National Archives and to Vice President Pence in his capacity as President of the Senate. In an email produced to the Select Committee, Dr. Eastman told a Trump campaign representative that it did not matter that the electors had not been approved by a state authority. Quote, the fact that we have multiple slates of electors demonstrates the uncertainty of either. That should be enough. He urged that Pence act boldly and be challenged. Documents produced to the Select Committee show that the Trump campaign took steps to ensure that the physical copies of the fake electors' electoral votes from 2 states were delivered to Washington for January 6th. Text messages exchanged between Republican Party officials in Wisconsin show that on January 4th, the Trump campaign asked for someone to fly their fake electors' documents to Washington. A staffer for Wisconsin Senator Ron Johnson texted a staffer for Vice President Pence just minutes before the beginning of the joint session. This staffer stated that Senator Johnson wished to hand-deliver to the vice president the fake electors' votes from Michigan and Wisconsin. The vice president's aide unambiguously instructed them not to deliver the fake votes to the vice president. Even though the fake elector slates were transmitted to Congress and the executive branch, the vice president held firm in his position that his role was to count lawfully submitted electoral votes.
And here's Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming.
Dr. Eastman himself admitted in an email that the fake electors had no legal weight, referring to the fake electors as, quote, dead on arrival in Congress, end quote, because they did not have a certification from their states.
But that didn't really matter in Eastman's plan. The role of the fake documents was simply to cause confusion, to set Vice President Pence up to say that because there were 2 certificates, because 2 slates of electors were submitted by those 7 states, the electoral votes that should go to Biden from those states would be set aside and the totals determined without them. The confusion was the goal. The crime that the January 6th committee concluded was committed was making material false statements to the federal government, which seems quite obvious considering they did it openly and in writing. And the Justice Department hasn't been waiting for the January 6th committee on this one. They have been investigating the fake elector schemes since at least January of 2022, so for at least a year. And the January 6th Commission just hand-delivered them a mountain of additional evidence. The committee also delivered evidence that Trump and friends violated another statute of federal law. Here's Jamie Raskin of Maryland.
We believe that there is more than sufficient evidence to refer former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violating Title 18, Section 371. This statute makes it a crime to conspire to defraud the United States. In other words, to make an agreement to impair, obstruct, or defeat the lawful functions of the United States government by deceitful or dishonest means. Former President Trump did not engage in a plan to defraud the United States acting alone. He entered into agreements, formal and informal, with several other individuals who assisted him with his criminal objectives. Our report describes in detail the actions of numerous co-conspirators who agreed with and participated in Trump's plan to impair, obstruct, and defeat the certification of President Biden's electoral victory.
In the January 6th committee's report, in the section explaining this one, they specifically named Jeffrey Clark as a co-conspirator in Trump's plan to remain president. Jeffrey Clark was a key figure in the part of the plan to get the Justice Department to notify the 7 states about fraud in their elections, despite the Justice Department finding no evidence of significant fraud in any of them. Not that the Justice Department would do that even if there was fraud. Here's Richard Donahue, who ended up as the acting Deputy Attorney General by the time this madness was over, explaining to the January 6th committee the proper role of the Justice Department.
So both the acting AG and I tried to explain to the president on this occasion and on several other occasions that the Justice Department has a very important, very specific, but very limited role in these elections. States run their elections. We are not quality control for the states. We are obviously interested in and have a mission that relates to criminal conduct in relation to federal elections. We also have related civil rights responsibilities. So we do have an important role. But the bottom line was, if a state ran their election in such a way that it was defective, that is to the state or Congress to correct. It is not for the Justice Department to step in. And I certainly understood the president as a layman, not understanding why the Justice Department didn't have at least a civil role to step in and bring suit on behalf of the American people. We tried to explain that to him. The American people do not constitute the client for the United States Justice Department. The one and only client of the United States Justice Department is the United States government. And the United States government does not have standing, as we were repeatedly told by our internal teams, OLC led by Steve Engel, as well as the Office of the Solicitor General, researched it and gave us thorough, clear opinions that we simply did not have standing. And we tried to explain that to the president on numerous occasions.
And so with that in mind, here's the testimony about what President Trump did to the Justice Department in his last 2 months in office. In the beginning of this episode, you heard the top officials at the Justice Department: Attorney General Bill Barr, Deputy Attorney General Jeff Rosen, and Associate Deputy Attorney General Richard Donahue. You heard all of them testify that they had personally told President Trump that the Justice Department investigated the Trump campaign's fraud claims and found none of them credible. And so let's pick up this story there. Here's Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming speaking to Cassidy Hutchinson, who again was the assistant to Mark Meadows, who was President Trump's chief of staff.
On December 1, 2020, Attorney General Barr said in an interview that the Department of Justice had not found evidence of widespread election fraud sufficient to change the outcome of the election. Ms. Hutchinson, how did the president react to hearing that news?
I left the office and went down to the dining room, and I noticed that the door was propped open and the valet was inside the dining room changing the tablecloth off of the dining room table. The valet had articulated that the president was extremely angry at the Attorney General's AP interview and had thrown his lunch against the wall.
Later that afternoon, Attorney General Barr, along with other Justice Department officials, met with President Trump in a 3-hour White House meeting.
And Ms. Hutchinson, Attorney General Barr described to the committee the president's angry reaction when he finally met with President Trump. Let's listen.
And I said, look, I know that you're dissatisfied with me, and I'm glad to offer my resignation. And he pounded the table very hard. Everyone sort of jumped, and he said, accept it.
And just like that, Attorney General Barr was out, and Jeff Rosen became the acting Attorney General. Here's Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi speaking to Jeff Rosen.
From the time you took over from Attorney General Barr until January 3rd, how often did President Trump contact you or the department to push allegations of election fraud?
So between December 23rd and January 3rd, the president either called me or met with me virtually every day, with 1 or 2 exceptions like Christmas Day.
And here's what happened during those communications. The following is a long montage of testimony from the top officials at the Justice Department during the chaotic holiday season of 2020-2021. In this group of clips, you're going to hear questions posed by Representatives Adam Kinzinger of Illinois and Liz Cheney of Wyoming. And the witnesses you'll hear from are first Jeff Rosen, the acting Attorney General during this time period, then Stephen Engel, who was the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel, and then Richard Donahue, who is the Deputy Attorney General. In these clips, you're going to hear some abbreviations. So AAG is Assistant Attorney General, and DOJ is Department of Justice. And they're going to drop a few names. And so Pat is Pat Cipollone, who was the White House counsel, so the top lawyer at the White House at the time. And they're also going to mention Chris Wray, who was the FBI director. But this clip montage is going to begin with a conversation about Jeffrey Clark. Here's Representative Adam Kinzinger speaking to Jeff Rosen.
So Mr. Clark was the acting head of the Civil Division and head of Environmental and Natural Resources Division at the Department of Justice. Do either of those divisions have any role whatsoever in investigating election fraud, sir?
No. And to my awareness, Jeff Clark had no prior involvement of any kind with regard to the work that the department was doing.
Is there a policy that governs who can have contact directly with the White House?
Yes. So across many administrations for a long period of time, there's a policy that, particularly with regard to criminal investigations, restricts at both the White House end and the Justice Department end those more sensitive issues to the highest ranks. So for criminal matters, the policy for a long time has been that only the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General from the DOJ side can have conversations about criminal matters with the White House, or the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General can authorize someone for a specific item with their permission, but the idea is to make sure that the top rung of the Justice Department knows about it and is in the thing to control it and make sure only appropriate things are done.
The purpose of these policies is to keep these communications as infrequent and at the highest levels as possible, just to make sure that people who are less careful about it, who don't really understand these implications, such as Mr. Clark, don't run afoul of those contact policies.
He acknowledged that shortly before Christmas, he had gone to a meeting in the Oval Office with the president. That, of course, surprised me, and I asked him, how did that happen? And he was defensive. He said it had been unplanned, that he had been talking to someone he referred to as General Perry, but I believe is Congressman Perry, and that unbeknownst to him, he was asked to go to a meeting and he didn't know it, but it turned out it was at the Oval. He found himself at the Oval Office, and he was apologetic for that. And I said, well, you didn't tell me about it. It wasn't authorized, and you didn't even tell me after the fact. You know, this is not appropriate. But he was contrite and said it had been inadvertent and it would not happen again, and that if anyone asked him to go to such a meeting, he would notify Rich Donahue and me.
On the same day, Acting Attorney General Rosen told Mr. Clark to stop talking to the White House, Representative Perry was urging Chief of Staff Mark Meadows to elevate Clark within the Department of Justice. You can now see on the screen behind me a series of texts between Representative Perry and Mr. Meadows. They show that Representative Perry requested that Mr. Clark be elevated within the department. Representative Perry tells Mr. Meadows on December 26th that, quote, Mark, just checking in as time continues to count down. 11 days to January 6th and 25 days to inauguration. We've got to get going. Representative Perry followed up and says, quote, Mark, you should call Jeff. I just got off the phone with him, and he explained to me why the principal deputy won't work, especially with the FBI. They will view it as not having the authority to enforce what needs to be done. Mr. Meadows responds with, I got it. I think I understand. Let me work on the deputy position.
Mr. Donahue, on December 28th, Mr. Clark emailed you and Mr. Rosen a draft letter that he wanted you to sign and send to Georgia state officials. This letter claims that the U.S. Department of Justice's investigations have, quote, identified significant concerns that may have impacted the outcome of the election in multiple states, including the state of Georgia. The letter also said this, quote, in light of these developments, the department recommends that the Georgia General Assembly should convene in special session, end quote, and consider approving a new slate of electors.
The states had chosen their electors. The electors had been certified. They'd cast their votes. They'd been sent to Washington, D.C. neither Georgia nor any of the other states on December 28th or whenever this was in a position to change those votes. Essentially, the election had happened. The only thing that hadn't happened was the formal counting of the votes.
I had to read both the email and the attached letter twice to make sure I really understood what he was proposing, because it was so extreme to me. I had a hard time getting my head around it initially. But I read it, and I did understand it for what he intended, and I had to sit down and sort of compose what I thought was an appropriate response. In my response, I explained a number of reasons this is not the department's role to suggest or dictate to state legislatures how they should select their electors. But more importantly, this was not based on fact. This was actually contrary to the facts as developed by department investigations over the last several weeks and months. So I responded to that, and for the department to insert itself into the political process this way, I think would have had grave consequences for the country. It may very well have spiraled us into a constitutional crisis, and I wanted to make sure that he understood the gravity of the situation, because he didn't seem to really appreciate it.
President Trump rushed back early from Mar-a-Lago on December 31st and called an emergency meeting with the department's leadership. Mr. Donahue, during this meeting, did the president tell you that he would remove you and Mr. Rosen because you weren't declaring there was election fraud?
Toward the end of the meeting, the president, again, was getting very agitated, and he said, people tell me I should just get rid of both of you. I should just remove you and make a change in the leadership, put Jeff Clark in, maybe something will finally get done.
Mr. Rosen, during a January 2nd meeting with Mr. Clark, did you confront him again about his contact with the president? And if so, can you describe that?
It was a contentious meeting where we were chastising him that he was insubordinate, he was out of line, he had not honored his own representations of what he would do. And he raised again that he thought that letter should go out, and we were not receptive to that.
So in that meeting, did Mr. Clark say he would turn down the president's offer if you reversed your position and signed the letter?
Yes. Subsequently, he told me that on Sunday the 3rd, he told me that the timeline had moved up and that the president had offered him the job and that he was accepting it.
White House call logs obtained by the committee show that by 4:19 p.m. on January 3rd, the White House had already begun referring to Mr. Clark as the acting attorney general. Well, let's ask about that. What was your reaction to that?
Well, on the one hand, I wasn't going to accept being fired by my subordinate, so I wanted to talk to the president directly.
So the four of us knew, but no one else, aside from Jeff Clark, of course, knew what was going on until late that Sunday afternoon. We chose to keep a close hold because we didn't want to create concern or panic in the Justice Department leadership. But at this point, I asked the acting AG, what else can I do to help prepare for this meeting at the Oval Office? And he said, you and Pat should get the AAGs on the phone, and it's time to let them know what's going on. Let's find out what they may do if there's a change in leadership, because that will help inform the conversation at the Oval Office. We got most, not all, but most of the AAGs on the phone. We very quickly explained to them what the situation was. All essentially said they would leave. They would resign en masse if the president made that change in the department leadership.
DOJ leadership arrived at the White House.
The conversation at this point was really about whether the president should remove Jeff Rosen and replace him with Jeff Clark. And everyone in the room, I think, understood that that meant that letter would go out. And at some point, the conversation turned to whether Jeff Clark was even qualified, competent to run the Justice Department, which in my mind, he clearly was not. And it was a heated conversation. I thought it was useful to point out to the president that Jeff Clark simply didn't have the skills, the ability, and the experience to run the department. And so I said, Mr. President, you're talking about putting a man in that seat who has never tried a criminal case, who's never conducted a criminal investigation. He's telling you that he's going to take charge of the department, 115,000 employees, including the entire FBI, and turn the place on a dime and conduct nationwide criminal investigations that will produce results in a matter of days. It's impossible. It's absurd. It's not going to happen, and it's going to fail. He has never been in front of a trial jury, a grand jury. He's never even been to Chris Wray's office. I said at one point, if you walked into Chris Wray's office, one, would you know how to get there? And two, if you got there, would he even know who you are? And do you really think that the FBI is going to suddenly start following your orders? It's not going to happen. He's not competent. And that's the point at which Mr. Clark tried to defend himself by saying, well, I've been involved in very significant civil and environmental litigation. I've argued many appeals in appellate courts and things of that nature. And then I pointed out that, yes, he was an environmental lawyer, and I didn't think that was appropriate background to be running in the United States Justice Department.
Did anybody in there support Mr. Clark?
No one. Along those lines, he said, so suppose I do this. So suppose I replace him, Jeff Rosen, with him, Jeff Clark. What would you do? And I said, Mr. President, I would resign immediately. I'm not working 1 minute for this guy, who I had just declared was completely incompetent. And so the president immediately turned to Mr. Engel.
My recollection is that when the president turned to me and said, Steve, you wouldn't leave, would you? I said, Mr. President, I've been with you through 4 attorneys general, including 2 acting attorney general, but I couldn't be part of this.
And then I said, and we're not the only ones. No one cares if we resign. If Steve and I go, that's fine. It doesn't matter. But I'm telling you what's going to happen. You're going to lose your entire department leadership. Every single AAG will walk out on you. Your entire department leadership will walk out within hours. And I said, Mr. President, within 24, 48, 72 hours, you could have hundreds and hundreds of resignations of the leadership of your entire Justice Department because of your actions. What's that going to say about you?
And then the other thing that I said was that, look, all anyone is going to sort of think about when they see this, no one is going to read this letter. All anyone is going to think is that you went through 2 attorneys general in 2 weeks until you found the environmental guy to sign this thing. And so the story is not going to be that the Department of Justice has found massive corruption that would have changed the result of the election. It's going to be the disaster of Jeff Clark. And I think at that point, Pat Cipollone said, yeah, this is a murder-suicide pact, this letter.
Mr. Cipollone, the White House counsel, told the committee that Mr. Engel's response had a noticeable impact on the president, that this was a turning point in the conversation. Mr. Donahue, towards the end of this meeting, did the president ask you what was going to happen to Mr. Clark?
He did. When we finally got to I would say the last 15 minutes of the meeting, the president's decision was apparent. He announced it. Jeff Clark tried to scrape his way back and asked the president to reconsider. The president doubled down, said, no, I've made my decision. That's it. We're not going to do it. And then he turned to me and said, so what happens to him now? Meaning Mr. Clark. And he understood that Mr. Clark reported to me. And I didn't initially understand the question. I said, Mr. President, and he said, are you going to fire him? And I said, I don't have the authority to fire him. He's a Senate-confirmed Assistant Attorney General. And he said, well, who has the authority to fire him? And I said, only you do, sir. And he said, well, I'm not going to fire him. I said, all right, well, then we should all go back to work.
The arrangement that President Trump made with Jeffrey Clark, the position of Attorney General, in return for him sending letters to state officials falsely stating that the Justice Department would essentially support them gathering new electors, the January 6th committee concluded that arrangement is evidence of a conspiracy. Now, I don't know how the Justice Department is going to handle the fact that Jeffrey Clark wasn't ultimately made Attorney General. But the heads of the Justice Department were ready to resign en masse over this, so we'll see. But this charge, conspiracy to defraud the United States, also encompasses the fact that President Trump knowingly made false statements to the courts in his 62 lawsuits. President Trump knew that the specific numbers of voter fraud that he submitted in his lawsuits were, quoting the Attorney General, quote, bullshit, unquote. But he filed those legal documents anyway. And that brings us to the last charge submitted to the Justice Department by the January 6th committee, one that hundreds of riotous bumpkins have been convicted of already, impeding an official proceeding. Here's Jamie Raskin of Maryland.
The first criminal statute we invoke for referral, therefore, is Title 18, Section 1512C, which makes it unlawful for anyone to corruptly obstruct, influence, or impede any official proceeding of the United States government. We believe that the evidence described by my colleagues today and assembled throughout our hearings warrants a criminal referral of former President Donald J. Trump, John Eastman, and others for violations of this statute. The whole purpose and obvious effect of Trump's scheme were to obstruct, influence, and impede this official proceeding, the central moment for the lawful transfer of power in the United States.
So by the time January 6th came around, the Trump team had laid the groundwork for their plan as best they could. They widely spread the lie that there was so much fraud in 7 states their electors should have gone to Trump instead of Biden. They put those lies into documents that were submitted to the courts. They pressured state officials to change their election results to reflect those lies. And when they wouldn't do that, they convened a second set of electors in those states to make sure there would be sufficient confusion on January 6th. They arranged, with the assistance of the official Republican Party, for fake electors to actually meet in 7 states that Biden won and created fake documents certifying those states for Trump, which they then submitted to the federal government to use on January 6th. They had the stage set for the chaos they needed and wanted on January 6th. Chaos that would give the Eastman plan a real shot. The next step would be for Vice President Pence to accept those illegitimate documents and set aside the electors from the contested states. Then either Trump would win because the math would change, or Trump would win when the House voted by state for president, assuming that all 26 state delegations that were majority Republican would vote for Trump to remain president despite his loss. In this part of the plan, Vice President Pence was key. The only problem is that Vice President Pence's lawyer thought the plan was totally illegal. Here's Representative Benny Thompson of Mississippi introducing Pence's lawyer to the January 6th committee.
Greg Jacob was counsel to Vice President Pence. He conducted a thorough analysis of the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress under the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and 230 years of historical practice. But he also has firsthand information about the attack on the Capitol because he lived through it. He was with the Vice President, and his own life was in danger.
And here's Greg Jacobs with his story.
We had a constitutional crisis in 1876 because in that year, multiple slates of electors were certified by multiple slates. And when it came time to count those votes, the antecedent question of which ones had to be answered. That required the appointment of an independent commission. That commission had to resolve that question, and the purpose of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 had been to resolve those latent ambiguities. Now, I'm in complete agreement with Judge Ludig. It is unambiguous that the Vice President does not have the authority to reject electors. There is no suggestion of any kind that it does. There is no mention of rejecting or objecting to electors anywhere in the 12th Amendment. And so the notion that the Vice President could do that certainly is not in the text. But the problem that we had and that John Eastman raised in our discussions was we had all seen that in Congress in 2000, in 2004, in 2016, there had been objections raised to various states. And those had even been debated in 2004. And so here you have an amendment that says nothing about objecting or rejecting, and yet we did have some recent practice of that happening within the terms of the Electoral Count Act. So we started with that text.
In 2000, after the disputed election results in Florida, Democratic members of the Congressional Black Caucus attempted to block Florida's electoral votes from being counted. In 2004, after credible reports of widespread voter disenfranchisement in Ohio, Democrats challenged the electors from Ohio. Never intending to stop them from being counted, they basically used the opportunity to make high-profile speeches about the need for election reform. And then in 2016, there were 7 so-called faithless electors who chose not to vote for the person they were supposed to and instead did their own thing. Clinton lost 5 electors and Trump lost 2. And yes, it is absolutely insane that we allow that to be possible. But none of these examples come even close to what the Trump team tried to do, inventing fraud where it didn't exist in 7 states and submitting fake documents certifying the wrong person as the election winner. That is so far beyond anything that's happened before in our history. But when you exploit a loophole, you set a precedent, which is why we should be very careful about what kind of shenanigans we're willing to support when our sides do them. It's also why we need to make sure that no precedents are set here. But back to Greg Jacobs describing his conversations with John Eastman about the coup plan.
He again tried to say, but I don't think the courts will get involved in this. They'll invoke the political question doctrine. And so if the courts stay out of it, that will mean that we'll have the 10 days for the states to weigh in and resolve it. And then they'll send back the Trump slates of electors and the people will be able to accept that. And I expressed my vociferous disagreement with that point. I did not think that this was a political question. Among other things, if the courts did not step in to resolve this, there was nobody else to resolve it. You would be in a situation where you have a standoff between the President of the United States and, counterfactually, the Vice President of the United States, saying that we've exercised authorities that constitutionally we think we have, by which we have deemed ourselves the winners of the election. You would have an opposed House and Senate disagreeing with that. You would have state legislatures that, to that point, Republican leaders across those legislatures had put out statements, and we collected these for the vice president as well, that the people had spoken in their states and that they had no intention of reversing the outcome of the election. We did receive some signed letters that Mr. Eastman forwarded us by minorities of leaders in those states, but no state had any legislative house that indicated that it had any interest in it. So you would have had just an unprecedented constitutional jump ball situation with that standoff. And as I expressed to him, that issue might well then have to be decided in the streets. Because if we can't work it out politically, we've already seen how charged up people are about this election. And so it would be a disastrous situation to be in. So I said, I think the courts will intervene. I do not see a commitment in the Constitution of the question whether the vice president has that authority to some other actor to resolve. There's arguments about whether Congress and the vice president jointly have a constitutional commitment to generally decide electoral vote issues. I don't think that they have any authority to object or reject them. I don't see it in the 12th Amendment, but nonetheless. And I concluded by saying, John, in light of everything that we've discussed, can't we just both agree that this is a terrible idea? And he couldn't quite bring himself to say yes to that, but he very clearly said, well, yeah, I see we're not going to be able to persuade you to do this. And that was how the meeting concluded.
And so now let's fast forward to the week of January 6th. In this testimony montage, you're going to hear Representative Pete Aguilar question Greg Jacob, and then you'll hear about a phone call that took place in the Oval Office with testimony from the people who were in the Oval Office and witnessed it, including Eric Hirschman, who was a senior advisor, a lawyer for President Trump. You'll hear from Ivanka Trump, who's Trump's daughter, Nicholas Luna, who's a former assistant to President Trump, then General Keith Kellogg, who's a former national security advisor to Vice President Pence, and then finally you'll hear from Julie Radford, who is the former chief of staff to Ivanka Trump.
We understand that the Vice President started his day on January 4th with a rally in Georgia for the Republican candidates in the U.S. Senate runoff. When the Vice President returned to Washington, he was summoned to meet with the President regarding the upcoming joint session of Congress. Mr. Jacob, during that meeting between the President and the Vice President, what theories did Dr. Eastman present regarding the role of the Vice President in counting the electoral votes?
During the meeting on January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were two legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise 2 days later on January 6th. One of them was that he could reject electoral votes outright. The other was that he could use his capacity as presiding officer to suspend the proceedings and declare essentially a 10-day recess during which states that he deemed to be disputed, there was a list of 5 to 7 states that the exact number changed from conversation to conversation, but that the vice president could sort of issue a demand to the state legislatures in those states to re-examine the election and declare who had won each of those states. So he said that both of those were legally viable options. He said that he did not recommend, upon questioning, he did not recommend what he called the more aggressive option, which was reject outright, because he thought that that would be less politically palatable. The imprimatur of state legislature authority would be necessary to ultimately have public acceptance of an outcome in favor of President Trump. And so he advocated that the preferred course of action would be the procedural route of suspending the joint session and sending the election back to the states. And again, the vice president's first instinct here is so decisive on this question. There's just no way that the framers of the Constitution, who divided power and authority, who separated it out, who had broken away from George III and declared him to be a tyrant, there was no way that they would have put in the hands of one person the authority to determine who was going to be president of the United States. And then we went to history. We examined every single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority, hadn't claimed authority to reject electoral votes, had not claimed authority to return electoral votes back to the states. In the entire history of the United States, not once had a joint session ever returned electoral votes back to the states to be counted. So the history was absolutely decisive. And again, part of my discussion with Mr. Eastman was, if you were right, don't you think Al Gore might have liked to have known in 2000 that he had authority to just declare himself president of the United States? Did you think that the Democrat lawyers just didn't think of this very obvious quirk that he could use to do that? And of course, he acknowledged Al Gore did not and should not have had that authority at that point in time. So at the conclusion of the meeting on the 4th, the president had asked that that our office meet with Mr. Eastman the next day to hear more about the positions he had expressed at that meeting, and the vice president indicated that sort of offered me up as his counsel to fulfill that duty. We had an extended discussion, an hour and a half to 2 hours on January 5th. What most surprised me about that meeting was that when Mr. Eastman came in, he said, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors." So on the 4th, that had been the path that he had said, "I'm not recommending that you do that." But on the 5th, he came in and expressly requested that.
Mr. Jacob, did you, Mr. Short, and the Vice President have a call later that day again with the President and Dr. Eastman?
So, yes, we did.
And what did Dr. Eastman request on that call?
On that phone call, Mr. Eastman stated that he had heard us loud and clear that morning. We were not going to be rejecting electors, but would we be open to considering the other course that we had discussed on the 4th, which would be to suspend the joint session and request that state legislatures re-examine certification of the electoral votes.
Trump issued a statement claiming that the vice president had agreed that he could determine the outcome of the election, despite the fact that the vice president had consistently rejected that position. Mr. Jacob, how did the vice president's team react to this statement from the president?
We were shocked and disappointed because whoever had written and put that statement out, it was categorically untrue.
Mr. Jacob, did you go to the vice president's residences on the morning of January 6th?
Yes.
And did the vice president have a call with the president that morning?
He did.
The president had several family members with him in the Oval that morning for that call. I'd like to show you what they and others told the Select Committee about that call.
When I got in, somebody called me and said that the family and others were in the Oval, and do I want to come up? So I went upstairs.
It wasn't a specific, formal discussion. It was very sort of loose and casual. When I entered the office the second time, he was on the telephone with who I later found out to be was the vice president.
Could you hear the vice president or only hear the president's end?
Only hear the president's end.
The conversation was pretty heated.
I think till it became somewhat, louder tone, I don't think anyone was paying attention to it initially.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what did you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, "You are a wimp, you'll be a wimp." Wimp is the word I remember.
It's also been reported that the president said to the vice president that something to the effect of, "You don't have the courage to make a hard decision."
Worse, I don't remember exactly either, but something like that, yeah. You're not tough enough to make the call.
It was a different tone than I'd heard him take with the vice president before.
Something to the effect, the wording's wrong. I made the wrong decision 4 or 5 years ago.
And the word that she relayed to that the president called the vice president, I apologize for being impolite, but do you remember what she said her father called him?
The P word?
Pussy. President Trump called his running mate a pussy for not participating in a coup attempt with him. And then President Trump went public with his pressure on Vice President Pence. Here's President Trump during his infamous pre-riot rally on January 6th and the reactions of the people who attended that rally.
I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. And we become president, and you are the happiest people. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And they want to recertify their votes. They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. And I hope he doesn't listen to the rhinos and the stupid people that he's listening to.
It's real simple. Pence betrayed us, which apparently everybody knew he was going to, and the president mentioned it like 5 times when he talked. You can go back and watch the president's video.
I'm telling you what, I'm hearing that Pence just caved.
No.
Is that true? I'm hearing reports that Pence caved. No, I'm telling you, if Pence caved, we're going to drag motherfuckers through the streets. You politicians are going to get drugged through the streets. Yeah.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here that Pence will decide to do the right thing, according to Trump.
Bring out Pence! Bring out Pence! Bring out Pence! Bring out Pence!
Those people, along with a few thousand others, marched to the Capitol building. And because of a stunning lack of preparation by the Capitol Police, about 800 of them were able to break into the building and disrupt the official proceeding. Meanwhile, President Trump went back to the White House and watched the riot on TV, being interrupted from time to time by members of his White House and family members begging him to do something to stop the riot. Here's Representative Pete Aguilar of California.
Although the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, has refused to testify before this committee, Mr. Meadows' aide, Ben Williamson, and White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews testified that Mr. Meadows went to the dining room near the Oval Office to tell the president about the violence at the Capitol before the president's 2:24 p.m. tweet. President Trump tweeted, "Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth." Our investigation found that immediately after the president's 2:24 p.m. tweet, the crowds both outside the Capitol and inside the Capitol surged. The crowds inside the Capitol were able to overwhelm the law enforcement presence, and the vice president was quickly evacuated from his ceremonial Senate office to a secure location within the Capitol complex.
Here's one of the lawyers for the January 6th committee asking questions to Greg Jacob, who was Vice President Pence's lawyer.
Mr. Jacob, immediately before you and the Vice President were evacuated to a secure location within the Capitol, you hit send on an email to John Eastman explaining why his legal theory about the Vice President's role was wrong. You ended your email by stating that, quote, "Thanks to your bullshit, we are now under siege." Now, Dr. Eastman replied, and this is hard to believe, but his reply back to you was, "The siege is because you and your boss," presumably referring to the Vice President of the United States, "did not do what was necessary to allow this to be aired in a public way so the American people can see for themselves what happened." Mr. Jacob, later that day, you wrote again to Dr. Eastman. In that email, you wrote, and I quote, "Did you advise the president that in your professional judgment, the vice president does not have the power to decide things unilaterally?" And you ended that email saying, "It does not appear that the president ever got the memo." Dr. Eastman then replied, "He's been so advised." And he ends his email with, quote, "But you know him, once he gets something in his head, it's hard to get him to change course," close quote.
Late that evening, after the joint session had been reconvened, Mr. Eastman emailed me to point out that, in his view, the vice president's speech to the nation violated the Electoral Count Act, that the Electoral Count Act had been violated because the debate on Arizona had not been completed in 2 hours. Of course, it couldn't be since there was an intervening riot of several hours. And that the speeches that the majority and minority leaders had been allowed to make also violated the Electoral Count Act because they hadn't been counted against the debate time. And then he implored me, now that we have established that the Electoral Count Act isn't so sacrosanct as you have made it out to be, I implore you one last time, can the Vice President please do what we've been asking him to do these last 2 days? Suspend the joint session, send it back to the states.
This is Eric Hirschman, one of the White House lawyers.
The day after, Eastman asked me about something dealing with Georgia and preserving something potentially for appeal. And I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right? I said, I only want to hear 2 words coming out of your mouth from now on. Orderly transition. And I screamed, I said, "I don't want to hear any other effing words coming out of your mouth, no matter what, other than orderly transition. Repeat those words to me." And I screamed that. Eventually he said, "Orderly transition." I said, "Good, John. Now I'm going to give you the best free legal advice you're ever getting in your life. get a great effing criminal defense lawyer, you're going to need it. And then I hung up on him.
Even after the riot, Trump's lawyer, John Eastman, kept trying. These people are just shameless. And they clearly knew that what they did was wrong because innocent people don't request presidential pardons. Here's Representative Pete Aguilar of California.
In fact, just a few days later, Dr. Eastman emailed Rudy Giuliani and requested that he be included on a list of potential recipients of a presidential pardon. Dr. Eastman did not receive his presidential pardon.
And Eastman wasn't the only one that wanted a pardon. Here's Representative Liz Cheney of Wyoming speaking to Mark Meadows' assistant, Cassidy Hutchinson.
Did White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows ever indicate that he was interested in receiving a presidential pardon related to January 6th?
Mr. Meadows did seek that pardon. Yes, ma'am.
Here's a January 6th committee lawyer speaking to White House lawyer Eric Hirschman.
And was Representative Gates requesting a pardon?
Believe so. The general tone was we may get prosecuted because we were defensive of the president's positions on these things. The pardon that he was requesting, was as broad as you could describe. From the beginning, I remember he's from the beginning of time up until today, for any and all things. He mentioned Nixon, and I said Nixon's pardon was never nearly that broad.
Here's a January 6th committee lawyer speaking to Cassidy Hutchinson.
And are you aware of any members of Congress seeking pardons?
I guess Mr. Gates and Mr. Brooks, I know, have both advocated for there to be a blanket pardon for members involved in that meeting and a handful of other members that weren't at the December 21st meeting as the preemptive pardons. Mr. Gates was personally pushing for a pardon, and he was doing so since early December. I'm not sure why. Mr. Gates had reached out to me to ask if he could have a meeting with Mr. Meadows about receiving a presidential pardon.
Did they all contact you?
Not all of them, but several of them did.
So you mentioned Mr. Gates, Mr. Brooks.
Mr. Biggs did. Mr. Jordan talked about congressional pardons, but he never asked me for one. It was more for an update on whether the White House is going to pardon members of Congress. Mr. Gomer asked for one as well. Mr. Perry asked for a pardon too. I'm sorry, I need to finish.
Mr. Perry, did he talk to you directly?
Yes, he did.
And if you've been watching the news this week, the week of January 6, 2023, the first week of the new 118th Congress, you may recognize a lot of those names of members of Congress because so many of them are still in the House of Representatives, and they are, while I'm recording this episode, currently preventing Kevin McCarthy from becoming Speaker of the House. Because the Republicans in the 118th Congress have such a small majority in the House that these treasonous Trump loyalists who put their party above the Constitution are not only in power still, but they are empowered. They are already using their power to bring the work of Congress to a screeching halt. Because we have to acknowledge, when we're looking at where we are now, that the Republican Party itself was a part of this coup attempt. And the Republican Party is not punishing the traitors within its ranks. Quite the opposite. Ronna Romney McDaniels, the head of the RNC who admitted that they helped Trump find people, between 5 and 20 Republican Party insiders per certificate, who would sign the certificates saying Trump won 7 states that he actually lost. Ronna Romney McDaniels is still the chair of the RNC. None of the powerful people who helped Trump with his coup attempt have gotten in trouble from the party. In fact, the only people who have been reprimanded by the party are the people who put country over party. Because for participating in the January 6th committee, the Republican Party formally censured Republican Representatives Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney. In the official Republican Party censure of these two representatives, it says, quote, Representatives Cheney and Kinzinger are participating in a Democrat-led persecution of ordinary citizens engaged in legitimate political discourse, unquote. And that is insane. The people who stood in the way of this coup attempt, and yes, it was a coup attempt, A coup is defined as, quote, a sudden, decisive exercise of force in politics, and especially the violent overthrow or alteration of an existing government by a small group, unquote. That's exactly what they tried to do. But the people who ultimately stopped it were almost all Republicans. Brad Raffensperger, Republican. Rusty Bowers, Republican. Bill Barr, Republican. Vice President Pence, Republican. The only way that you can call this a partisan persecution of ordinary citizens, we're talking about the President of the United States here, for Christ's sake. The only way that you can call this partisan is if you yourself are a shameless partisan who cares only about your side winning. Now, luckily, the Republican Party is obviously divided, and there are people within its ranks right now that valued their oaths to the country and Constitution more than their corrupt party. But the party is currently headed by one of the people who helped Trump. The party is currently changing the rules of the House of Representatives to satisfy the very same people, Andy Biggs, Matt Gaetz, Scott Perry, who tried to help President Trump pull off that coup. Now, Donald Trump is out of office for now, but the Republican Party is allowing him to run for president again in their 2024 primary. And so clearly the rot in the Republican Party still remains. And they are rotting our Congress right now from the inside as I speak. As I was writing this script, Kevin McCarthy, while trying to convince the Trump co-conspirators in Congress to vote for him for Speaker, he called Donald Trump himself to ask for support, which Donald Trump gave him. And so not only is Donald Trump free, not only is Donald Trump not in jail for any of this, but he's being treated like a respected leader of the Republican Party because he is. And that's a fucking problem. Like, are we going to allow the people who participated in this to remain unpunished and in power? Are we really going to pretend that this current version of the Republican Party is normal and okay? Are we really going to sit back and just hope the Justice Department follows through on these criminal referrals? Like, will we ever punish the ever increasing extremism in the Republican Party at the ballot box? And as far as, holding the Republicans who participated in this accountable with our votes, this is where the Democratic Party just royally fucked up. Because until I watched these hearings for myself, I really didn't understand what the Trump loyalists in the Republican Party tried to do in the months leading up to January 6th. And so I can't really be mad at voters for failing to hold members of Congress accountable for actions that they weren't fully aware of when they went to vote. Because no one has told this story to Americans in a concise and clear way. In fact, even I think I took too long with this episode. But the January 6th committee, they took 23 hours to tell this story. 23 hours spread out over 4 months. Most of those hours aired midday, and with hours and hours and hours of that focused on documenting and re-documenting literally every moment of the riot. And who has the time to sit through that? And to filter the coup story out from behind the endless videos of screaming rioters? The riot was a part of the story, but it wasn't the main event. But you'd have to be forgiven if that wasn't clear from the bits and pieces of the hearings you may have caught live or had summarized for you on the news. And the ending of this committee resulting in non-binding referrals to the Justice Department, it really does feel really inadequate because these hearings should have been impeachment hearings. The result of this should be the disqualification of Donald Trump from becoming president again. But because the Democrats reacted so rashly to the riot, because they were personally threatened and traumatized, they impeached first and investigated second. And now the Justice Department is the only avenue for accountability left, at least until 2024, when it sure appears that we're going to be treated to another Donald Trump tainted election. And I really hope this isn't the end of this story, because it's not a good look for our country to even consider letting that guy anywhere near the presidency again. But even though 2024 with Trump involved is, oh my God, just impossible for me to even fathom right now. I don't even want to think about it. But the good news here is that at the end of the 117th Congress, just a few weeks ago, when Congress did their annual shameful budgeting gimmick and funded the entire government in one 4,000-page bill, inside that 4,000-page bill, they did include some changes to our election process that are intended to, and I think will, close at least some of the loopholes that President Trump tried to exploit in the Eastman-inspired coup attempt. So first, one of the changes that was made is that when it comes to appointing electors, the electors are going to have to be appointed on election day. And 6 days before the meeting of the electors, the states are going to have to issue a certificate containing the names of the electors and submit that list of names to the archivist of the United States. And this is going to prevent slates of electors from being gathered after the election, like the Republican Party officials gathered to help Trump in those 7 states. The bill also makes it, or law, I should say, the new law makes it crystal clear that the vice president's role on future January 6s is to be, quote, ministerial in nature, unquote. The law now says that the vice president, quote, shall have no power to solely determine, accept, reject, or otherwise adjudicate or resolve disputes over the proper certificate of ascertainment of appointment of electors, the validity of electors, or the votes of electors, unquote. So vice president is simply reading the results. That's it. And so that loophole, at least, is officially closed. Also, challenges to the acceptance of electors in Congress on future January 6s were made significantly harder by the new law. Donald Trump had a small group of Republicans willing to help him with the coup attempt in Congress, but he only needed a small group because to challenge a state, there only needed to be 1 member of the House and 1 from the Senate for each state. But from now on, the new threshold for challenging a state's elector certification will be at least 1/5 of the Senate, so that's 20 senators, and 1/5 of the House, which is 87 representatives. And the only reasons that these members of Congress will be allowed to challenge a state's electors is if the electors weren't lawfully certified or if there were no elector votes submitted at all. And then finally, the terms president-elect and vice president-elect have now been officially eliminated from federal law. Instead, we're going to have, quote, apparent successful candidates, unquote. And the reason for this is that the new law is going to allow information to be given to more than one candidate for transition purposes while the election results are being worked on. This is because the Biden administration was essentially prevented from doing important transition work while the Trump team tried to remain in the White House. And so that's good. But unfortunately, these changes are not enough. Because, for example, our system still allows for faithless electors. We have 538 human beings, all party insiders, who are empowered to vote however they want during the certification process. Many states do have punishments for faithless electors, but if those humans choose to just serve their time, they are empowered to choose the president, our votes be damned. That's an obvious constitutional loophole that can be exploited by the next Trump. Or the actual Trump if he doesn't end up behind bars for any of this and is able to become president again. And I'm hoping Republican voters won't allow that to happen, but I don't want to leave that up to chance. They voted for him the first time. In fact, millions of people voted for him the second time. And so I'm just really afraid that this, if it remains the way it is now and no one is punished for this, I shouldn't say no one because there are hundreds of rioters that have been punished for this. But Donald Trump needs to be punished for this. And I don't want the precedent to be set that a president can get away with a coup attempt as long as it's unsuccessful. And so I think we Americans need to take this seriously. And I don't feel like we have been, mainly because I don't feel like I have been. I don't feel like I knew this story. But I think we need to put partisanship aside on this one, like Adam Kinzinger and Liz Cheney did, both of whom experienced the wrath of the Republican Party and lost their congressional seats over this. But here's Liz Cheney in the final January 6th committee hearing explaining so eloquently why this matters.
Why would Americans assume that our Constitution and our institutions in our republic are invulnerable to another attack? Why would we assume that those institutions will not falter next time? A key lesson of this investigation is this: our institutions only hold when men and women of good faith make them hold, regardless of the political cost. We have no guarantee that these men and women will be in place next time. Any future president inclined to attempt what Donald Trump did in 2020 has now learned not to install people who could stand in the way. And also, please consider this: the rulings of our courts are respected and obeyed because we as citizens pledge to accept and honor them. Most importantly, our president, who has a constitutional obligation to faithfully execute the laws, swears to accept them. What happens when the president disregards the court's rulings as illegitimate? When he disregards the rule of law? That, my fellow citizens, breaks our republic.
That's what's at stake if we don't learn from this. And Trump-proof our electoral process. That's what's at stake if January 6th is only remembered as a riot, and if everything leading up to it remains largely misunderstood. So, if I was successful in helping you understand what the importance of the January 6th committee investigation was, if I was successful in helping you understand the mechanics of the former president's coup attempt, please share this episode widely. Because I did my best to pull out the testimony and try and tell you the really important stuff here. And if it helped you understand, I want to help other people understand. So please share this with your friends and family who, I wish you would share this with every American, because I just don't think that this story was well told by this committee or by anyone else up until this point. But yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this episode. I do want to address the end of my last episode where I was tired and grumpy and I threatened to stop doing this job and instead go into porn. This is a listener-supported podcast, and for the last 3 weeks, during the holidays, taking breaks from my time with family and missing out on time with friends and producing this episode instead, I kept getting notifications on my phone. There were Venmos and PayPals and so many new patrons, and I was inspired by each and every one of you during this process. I felt very empowered to be able to tell this story to this many people. I think it's a privilege to have the power to spread the word about things that matter. And this episode reminded me of that. You really helped lift me up. Everyone who donated and reached out during the last 3 weeks, during the holidays, you really helped me. And so thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for helping me build this opportunity to share stories like this over these last 10 years. And yeah, thank you to all of the new names. I want to be careful here because I definitely love hearing from and knowing all of my Congressional Dish regulars, all of the producers. But in these last few weeks, I got so many notifications from names I didn't recognize. We have 27 new patrons. And so I really felt the support. And each of you who heard my struggle and decided that now is the time to help, you made a difference with this episode. You drove me. So thank you. Despite having 8,000 pages of recently signed legislation to start working through and having no breaks over the holidays from working at all, I'm actually feeling renewed and I'm feeling ready to go on this. So that was because of you. So thank you very much. And if you want to keep me going through those 8,000 pages of legislation, this is a listener-supported podcast. Please go to congressionaldish.com on the support page and support the show in whatever amount you think is fair. We run on the value for value business model here, which means I produce an episode of value and you pay for it whatever you think is fair. And we don't take ads here, never will. I'll get into that another day. But yeah, thank you for supporting the podcast. I really appreciate each and every one of you who do. And I'm very excited to tell you that the streak of episodes with no executive producers has been broken. And it came right down to the wire because as I was finishing up writing the script, Adam D came through with a flash executive producer credit, sending in the full 535 all at once. And his credit is going to go on Congressional Dish 259, which is the CHIPS Act episode. And along with that payment, he sent in this message. He said, "Thank you so much for episode 259 about the CHIPS Act. I believe the semiconductor industry is a perfect illustration of the negative consequences of financialization and deindustrialization on our country. As someone who worked in the industry, I am proud to help produce this episode. Similar to the Inflation Reduction Act, I tend to think that CHIPS was close to the best that could be achieved given the composition of Congress at the time. Hopefully one day we'll have an entire caucus of economic patriots that can get amendments like Bernie's across the finish line." Adam. And in case you don't know what he's talking about, Bernie Sanders tried to amend that bill to make sure that we got a return on our investment. So basically, Bernie's amendment would have prevented microchip companies from receiving taxpayer money unless they agree to issue equity stakes to the federal government. So basically, he would have ensured that we share in the profits of our tax money investments. And also, Bernie Sanders' amendment would have required that if microchip companies receive taxpayer assistance, they would have to agree that they would not buy back their own stock or outsource American jobs overseas or repeal existing collective bargaining agreements if they were going to take our money. And of course, that did not become a part of the law. So these companies are just getting lots of our tax money, and we have no real return on that investment guaranteed. So yeah, thank you so much, Adam. That made me very, very happy today. And I will let you know that that was the first executive producer credit on the CHIPS Act episode. If you're a new listener, executive producers are people that pay a significant portion of an episode's production costs. But because you never know what episode I'm producing next, I allow executive producers to pick whatever episode or episodes that they are most proud of to have helped produce. Each credit is listed in the description for the episode that it's applied to, even if the producer wants to remain anonymous. And by seeing how many executive producers an episode has, it's a really good way to figure out what episodes are considered the most valuable by the people who are invested in this show. And as of this recording, the top episode remains Congressional Dish 186 about the National Endowment for Democracy with 3 executive producers. And so if you're listening to this podcast for the first time because someone shared it with you because you didn't know the story of the run-up to January 6th, the story of the attempted coup, if this is your first time listening to this show and you want to keep going, the market is saying that Congressional Dish 186 is the best episode of Congressional Dish. And after that, there are 11 episodes tied for second place with 2 executive producers each. And those are the World Trade Organization episode, Controlling Puerto Rico, the sanctions episode about Russia, North Korea, and Iran, the episode about the Federal Reserve, the episode about nuclear waste storage, Minerals Are the New Oil, which I think is a really important episode just for big picture geopolitical reasons, the episode about long COVID, the episode about hunting domestic terrorists, which was actually the episode after the Capitol riot episode, because they kept calling the rioters domestic terrorists. And so I was afraid there was going to be a new domestic terrorism law, which now that the Congress is over, I haven't read the final bills yet, but so far, I don't know of anything crazy becoming law. So we dodged a bullet with that one. Also, we have 2 EPs on losing Afghanistan, Congress Saves the Postal Service, and the Inflation Reduction Act. And then there are 39 episodes that are tied for third place, now including the CHIPS Act episode with 1 executive producer. And I'm intending to work on a way to put this list on congressionaldish.com and keep it updated so that everyone can see what episodes the executive producers consider the most valuable. And I'll let you know when I figure that out. But until then, I am going to get together with my team and we're going to come up with a plan for how to tackle 8,000 pages. And we're going to get to work on that because it is not clear when this Congress is even going to begin because of the chaos caused by the crazies in the Republican Party in the House. So, yeah, we've got some time to work on what the 117th Congress did at the end. So, yeah, thanks again for supporting the show. Thanks again for listening and sharing. And I will talk to you as soon as I figure out how to tackle all those pages. All right. Take care. Thanks again. Talk to you soon. Bye.
We're surrounded now by liars coming at us through our TV screens.
We don't have a domestic spying program.
They're content to fight in black and white despite the many in-betweens. We got a president who plays with the facts. And then he waves a flag to cover his tracks. As if a lie is alright, if the end will justify the means. Now we are so damn tired of being lied to.
The polar ice caps aren't going away.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can stick to your story if you think it lies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. We are so damn tired of being lied to.
Government jobs consume the profits of the private sector.
We don't think we can deny it anymore. You can't stick to your story if you think it flies. But we're not keeping quiet anymore. Now we're not keeping quiet.
These bills represent common sense, bipartisan solutions that actually solve problems.